If you don't get your book edited, your writing will be poor and sales and reviews will suffer. On the other hand, if you blindly accept every editorial suggestion, your writing will be generically dull and sales and reviews will suffer. And to navigate this gauntlet, professional authors develop something called voice. Your writing voice comes from knowing when to listen and when to ignore editorial feedback. Sure, it's easy to say that, but how do you know when to listen? How do you know when an edit is a good edit? Well, find out on this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to get new marketing tips and tricks every week. A few weeks ago, I launched a new patron toolbox tool called Not a Developmental Editor that gives immediate editorial feedback. And patrons started using and loving this tool. But then several of them contacted me wondering if they could trust the feedback. Just because Not a Developmental Editor says to change something, should I? If this tool says my writing is good, is my writing good? These questions are great questions. In fact, you should ask them not just about AI editors, but about feedback from human editors as well. So I think this is one of the benefits of AI editors, actually, is that they're bringing a healthy suspicion of editorial feedback. Editorial feedback is critical for success, but you have to interpret it. And to help you do that, I've put together 7 bewares. And the first is beware the flatterer. Some authors don't really want editorial feedback. They want flattery. They want an editor to tell them that what they've written is a masterpiece and it just needs some tiny, easy tweaks. There's a whole ecosystem of these kinds of sycophantic human editors, and they often come really well recommended by authors who were also flattered by the feedback. And don't think that AI is any less sycophantic. The nature of machine learning is that all AIs tend toward flattery over time. Humans like to be flattered, and they tend to give a conversation a thumbs up when that conversation is flattering, which then trains the AI to flatter even more. And this is dangerous. It's the devil who tells you that you're perfect just the way you are. This is a lie, and deep down, you know that it's a lie. You're not perfect just the way you are. God calls you to repent and to live a better life. The good news is that you are not stuck where you are. You can become more than what you are, and with hard work and discipline, you can improve as a human and as a writer. And this is why flattery is so dangerous. People can get addicted to sycophantic affirmations. These can be deadly as they encourage vice and discourage the pursuit of virtue. And for writers, this toxic positivity is the path to mediocrity and obscurity. If you aspire to greatness, you need to find advisors who are truth speakers, even if the truth is hard to hear. Now, AIs will flatter you because the machine learning reinforced flattery and pushed them to flatter you. Human editors will flatter you because you are paying them money. So keep this in mind when it comes to feedback. It doesn't matter what your editor thinks of your book. This is really important. The AI editor's opinion doesn't matter. The human editor's opinion doesn't matter. The only opinions that matter are your readers, and if you're religious, your God's. Love your reader, love your God. These are the greatest writing commandments. A good editor will help you serve your readers, but never forget that it's the readers who pay the bills. All of the money in this industry comes from readers. Never forget that. So beware the flatterer. But as you look for truth speakers, you want to look for editors who can speak the truth in love. And I'll show you how to find this kind of editor later on in the episode. But first, we need to talk about the second beware, which is beware your own ignorance. One challenge early writers face is that they don't know enough about craft to be able to interpret the feedback that they get from editors. They lack fluency in the language of writing, and they don't know how to know whether a change is a good change, so they just accept all of the changes. This is a very common problem, and it has a very simple solution. But in my experience, most authors make excuses because they don't like this simple solution. So don't be one of those excuse-making authors and listen to the advice I'm about to give you with an open mind. At least try to hear it with an open mind. It will protect you from blindly following your editor into mediocrity. So what is the simple solution? Reading. You've likely read that if you want to be a writer, you must be a reader, and this is true. But what should you read? To be excellent in the craft of writing, you need to read 3 kinds of books. Books on craft, classics in your genre, and the current bestsellers of your genre. These 3 categories of reading are the 3 legs of a stool. And if you have all three, you can develop genre fluency, and that is key to success. Now, most authors make excuses for why they don't need all three legs for their stool, and their lack of genre fluency becomes immediately obvious to readers. So let's talk about the three legs. Classics in your genre are what brought readers into the genre in the first place. These are the books that stood the test of time for a reason. And you can learn a lot about what excellence looks like by reading these classics. This is the least controversial type of book to read, and if you don't think that you can learn anything from reading the classics, then I don't know how to help you. The second kind of book is books on craft. Reading a book on writing captivating dialogue will help you read conversations in the classics with new eyes. You will see how the sausage is made, so to speak, and it will allow the books that you're reading to be even more educational. The same is true for books on plot and characters and tension and sentences and all of the rest. The more books you read on craft, the more you'll learn from the classics and bestsellers that you're reading. In our course, the 5-year plan, our students read a craft book every month and then write a short story each month as a drill to enforce what they learned in the craft book that they read that month. And this approach has proven to have remarkable results. There's a few craft books I recommend if you don't know where to get started. Those are Elements of Style by Strunk and White, How to Write a Novel Using the Snowflake Method by Randy Ingermanson, and Write Your First Novel by Steve Lobby and Gilbert Morris. The third leg of the stool, and perhaps the most controversial, is current bestsellers. The current bestsellers in your genre will tell you a lot about what is resonating with readers right now. They'll give you a sense of the zeitgeist and a sense of how style has changed over the years, and particularly since the classics came out. Because a book that's a classic in a genre isn't necessarily still a bestseller in that genre, at least not today. The current bestsellers will also prevent you from being accidentally derivative, which is the worst kind of derivative. Now, lazy authors will make the excuse that they don't want to read current bestsellers in their genre because if they do, they will be derivative. And I've noticed that these lazy authors who make this excuse often seem surprised that their books have so few reviews on Amazon. They just have no idea how their book is out of line with reader expectations because they have no idea what those reader expectations even are. So a final benefit of reading classics, craft books, and bestsellers is that they will combine to help you develop a key element of your voice, which is taste. To have a good authorial voice, you must first develop good readership taste. Have good taste in books, good taste in fiction. And how can you have good taste if the only version of the book you've read is the movie? As authors continue in the habit of reading, I've noticed that they tend to spiral outside of their genre into related genres, and then ultimately genres related to those genres. And this broadening of your reading can really help you develop your taste, but I recommend that you fully develop your genre fluency first and then start expanding your horizons. This is really important. You have to be fluent in your genre if you want to be a bestseller in your genre. And you can't be a bestseller until you're a bestseller in your genre. So you got to be faithful with the little things. The next beware is beware the fool. I once heard a story of a young man who wrote a captivating military science fiction, and an agent read the first couple of chapters and was really excited about it and wanted to see the entire manuscript. So the young man went to his critique group and got feedback on his manuscript before sending it to the agent. The critique group consisted mostly of unpublished romance authors who encouraged him to make his protagonist more in touch with his feelings. This seemed like good advice. His starship captain was a bit one-dimensional after all, so the young man rewrote the book and made the starship captain introspective and insecure. And in doing so, he created a monstrosity. His story lost its masculine clarity while still lacking any appeal to female readers. The authors in his critique group were well-meaning, but they didn't know what they didn't know, and they led him into writing a book for no one. A book that languishes in the pit of obscurity to this very day. When seeking counsel, it is vital to seek wise counsel. Any fool can give you his opinion, and most fools will. But just because someone has an opinion about your book, that doesn't mean that you should heed that opinion. So how do you find wise counsel? How do you find someone who can speak the truth in love and who actually knows what the truth is? Well, here are 4 things to keep an eye out for. The first is you want an editor who is well read. And specifically, you want to look for editors who are well read in your genre. So during that initial phone call, you want to see if they've read your genre's classics and the current bestsellers in your genre. The more well-read you are, the better you can vet the editors. So this is one of the reasons why it's really important for you to be well-read, so you can have a conversation about which books in your genre you like and dislike and why. So during that interview, you want to ask also about the craft books that they've read. You want to determine if your editor understands why readers read and love your genre. Do they have a sense of the changing taste in your genre, or have they not read any books in your genre in the last 2 or 3 years? If somebody wants to edit Christian fantasy and they haven't read Brian Godawa or S.D. Smith, how can you trust that they know what they're talking about when it comes to what Christian fantasy readers want to read? And this is true for every genre and microgenre. And you won't know who the best-selling authors in your microgenre are if you haven't read them, if you're not familiar with the bestseller lists. Just because an editor is good in one genre doesn't mean that they're good in every genre. Savvy editors know to focus their editing on a handful of genres. Now, warning, if the only craft training they've received was in a university setting, this is a red flag. Academic editors struggle to cultivate commercial success. The academy is not the real world. If you want to succeed in the real world, you want an editor who has had real world success and not somebody from academia. The number 2 thing I recommend that you look for is a track record of success. Has the editor worked on books that went on to be bestsellers? Typically, bestsellers don't happen by accident, and usually either the author or the editor has been on the bestseller list before. And it's not uncommon for all of the top authors in a microgenre to quietly all use the same 1 or 2 editors. And so filtering for past success is also a really good way to weed out sycophantic editors, because flattery does not create best-selling books. Now, warning, the less experienced you are as an author, the more experience you need in your editorial team. The time to work with a new editor is at the end of your career, not at the beginning. So a common mistake I'll see is a brand new author who's working with a brand new editor, and it's the blind leading the blind. It's not a good situation. The third thing that you want to look for is tryout success. I recommend hosting a tryout for editors before picking a final editor. And I recommend hiring the best 3 editors that you can find. And if you haven't found very many editors, you need to get in the mix and go to some conferences, hang out on authormedia.social, and be around more editors. Don't just hire the first person you find. So as you build up your list of potential editors, find the top 3, hire them all to edit the same chapter of your book. Be clear that this is a tryout and pay them for their work. Editing a single chapter won't be too expensive. And then you can compare apples to apples the quality of the feedback to see which editor gave you the most useful feedback. Now, warning, if you haven't read enough books on craft, you won't know enough to judge this competition, and you'll end up picking the flatterer. So, I know I keep harping on this reading thing, but it really is the foundation. You have to be a reader before you can be a writer. The fourth and final thing to look for is ideological alignment. Not every editor is an activist, but many of them are. Now, is that a problem? It depends. Are you an activist? If so, then an activist editor could be a great fit. But if your editor is ideologically opposed to you, how can you trust the feedback? And this is true even for fiction, because fiction's very ideological. The worldview of fiction's sometimes even more intense than the worldview of nonfiction. You want an editor who shares your worldview and is on your side, helping you succeed. Or to put it another way, you don't want an editor who secretly thinks the world would be a better off if you failed commercially. So, do you have to agree with your editor on every little thing in order to work together? Of course not. But you should have general agreement on what the good, the true, and the beautiful are. If the editor hates your favorite book in your genre, that's a red flag. If your editor voted for a rival political party, that's a red flag. If your editor is from a different religion, that's a red flag, even if you're not writing a religious book. If your editor suggests that you bring on a sensitivity reader from outside your target audience, that is a giant red flag. But there's a warning here as well. Ideological alignment is not enough. This is the last item on the list for a reason. Just because someone agrees with you ideologically, that doesn't make them actually a good editor. Excellence matters. A common mistake I see authors is that they look only at ideology and at nothing else. So they'll say something like, the only thing that matters to me is that my editor is a Christian. And this is a foolish heuristic for authors who aspire to commercial success. So this is a thing to look at. It's not the thing to look at. Our next beware is beware of Grammarly and ProWritingAid. I remember when I was a kid, I first started using Microsoft Word at like 8 or 9 years old. And at the time, I was terrible at spelling. And half the words I typed into that old Windows 95 computer had red squigglies under them. Anyone who's gotten a text from me is like, Thomas, nothing has changed. You're still terrible at spelling. But believe me, it was way worse when I was young. And I loved those red squigglies. I relied on them. I trusted them. They told me when I had typed a word incorrectly, and there was a correct way to spell a word and a wrong way. And when I chose the wrong way, the red squiggly was there to tell me that I had sinned against the English language. Now, Grammarly and ProWritingAid use the same design vocabulary that Microsoft Word used back in the day. But now they put red squiggly lines under suggestions. If I type the word big, Grammarly might put a red squiggly under the word and say, choose a different word, and then suggest I use the word large instead. It no longer explains why I should change and use a different word. It just demands that I change. And that demand is presented in the same visual language that used to tell me that I had sinned against the English language by misspelling a word. Now, is it possible that the word large is a better word to use? Sure. The problem is not in the suggestion. The problem is that how Grammarly conveys that suggestion, and it does it in the morally charged language of right and wrong. If I want to get rid of the red squiggly lines, the easiest way to do it is to accept the changes. But when I accept every change that an AI editing tool like Grammarly or ProWritingAid present, my author voice will be lost. I'll end up picking the same words that every other Grammarly user picks, and most authors use Grammarly. Now, if you've studied craft and you're confident in the quality of your writing, Grammarly and ProWritingAid can still be time-saving tools. But if you've only read a handful of books on craft, you'll be tempted to accept all the changes that the AI tool suggests. And once you hand your words to an AI, you've started walking the path to generic mediocrity, conformity, and obscurity. Grammarly used to be a great tool that would explain the grammar rules and help you improve your craft. Now it wants to be a tool that you're perpetually dependent on, and it wants to have control over your language. And as a student of history, this kind of control over language is very scary to me. Certain political actors love controlling the words that other people use. They see control over language as a source of political power. And they also use it as a way to tell if you're already cowed into submission. This thinking comes from a school of thought that if you can control the words people use, you can control the thoughts that they think. If you can control the thoughts they think, you can control their actions. And once you control people's actions, you can control the world and create a utopia. This totalitarian ideology is at odds with the Western tradition of beautiful art and free speech. So when a San Francisco-based Grammarly nags us into using politically correct language, realize that they may be trying to control our language as a way of controlling our thoughts and ultimately the world. It's about political power. Now, I've been a paying Grammarly user for almost a decade, and I just let my subscription lapse because I want to regain control over my words. I know myself enough to know that I can't resist correcting a red squiggly line. I just came to trust it too much when I was young. I was conditioned to always accept red squiggly suggestions. Now, I'm not just complaining about this. I've also built a tool to help. I now have a tool called Not a Copy Editor that will give you copy edits for your book in a separate page that you can then review. And you can decide if you want to incorporate those suggestions or not. And they're presented as just that. Suggestions. Now, it's a little less convenient, but I think that extra friction may be really good for helping preserve your authorial voice. Now, to be fair, I'm not totally against tools like Grammarly and ProWritingAid. They're like a gun. They're a powerful tool that is dangerous, and it takes training and practice to use the gun safely, and it takes training and practice to use a tool like ProWritingAid without losing your voice. For now, I'm going to continue using Grammarly. I'm just going to use the free version, which is less likely to swap out my words for different words. I wanted to focus on commas, which is an area in which I sadly struggle quite a bit. So just remember that AI tools like Grammarly are not a replacement for studying craft and developing your own taste and your own craft. And if you want to stand out in a crowded marketplace, don't delegate your taste to a San Francisco-based tech company. And this leads us to our next beware, which is beware the trade-offs. Some edits are cheap. When you correct the spelling of a word or resolve a comma splice, the writing is improved with no corresponding downside. For a rough draft, even developmental edits can be cheap with very little downside as well. But as the manuscript improves, potential edits start to come with trade-offs. For instance, adding more action means a lower percentage of dialogue, and vice versa. More time developing the side characters is less time to devote to the main characters, and vice versa. Now accepting and rejecting the edits requires judgment, taste, and courage. Because nothing is perfect, and there will always be improvements that could be made. But eventually, a piece of writing gets good enough where improvements also mean adding a corresponding disimprovement. And if you're not careful, you can get caught in a never-ending loop of changes that do nothing but remove your words, your voice, and your story. To explain this concept, let's talk about lemonade. Lemonade consists of water, sugar, salt, lemon juice, and ice. And if you're making lemonade with corn syrup, let's say, switching to white sugar makes it taste better with no trade-off in taste. But there's still a trade-off. Sugar is more financially expensive than corn syrup. And almost every lemonade mix uses corn syrup solids to save money. So there's potentially a time trade-off as well. But when it comes to taste, there's no trade-off. Sugar just tastes better. And adding more lemon juice makes it more sour and less sweet and less refreshing, while adding more water makes it more hydrating but less sweet and less sour, and so on. So there's this constant trade-off back and forth when it comes to taste. So what is the perfect ratio of sweet, sour, and hydrating? Well, some lemonade drinkers prefer just a touch of sweetness. Others want to drink candy. So there's no lemonade recipe that will appeal to everyone. There's no platonically perfect lemonade in the ideal realm or in the cognitive realm. This is why you need to have both good taste and you need to know your audience. Children prefer a sweeter lemonade, while health-conscious adults prefer a healthier, more hydrating option. So should the writing in your book be more conversational or more academic? It depends. Timing is also an issue here. The last time my daughter hosted a lemonade stand, some of the cyclists rode by and they stopped for lemonade. And one of them remarked, "This is the best lemonade I've ever had." And he really seemed to mean it. He wasn't just trying to flatter my daughter. And I remember thinking, yeah, I bet this probably is, because riding a bicycle for dozens of miles made that lemonade perfect for him. If he had just eaten Thanksgiving dinner, followed by black coffee and pecan pie, I imagine that exact same lemonade would have been much less appealing. So where you are and when you are really matters. And this is where your judgment and the cultural zeitgeist meet. Reader tastes change over time. I'm not always in the mood for sweet lemonade, and readers are not always in the mood for relatable heroes. Sometimes they want aspirational heroes instead. And to make things even more fun, culture is not a monolith. Each culture has its own zeitgeist. So when in doubt, ask your Timothy. I have a whole episode on that, which we'll link to in the blog version of this episode. So tools like Not a Developmental Editor are tuned to always give suggestions for improvements. But it can't tell you if the change is worth the cost. That kind of judgment must be made by you, the human author. And if the human editor wants to muscle in and have the final say, just ask her whose name is on the cover of the book. As Eurylochus says in Epic the Musical, if you want all the power, you must carry all the blame. Not a developmental editor is not a tool that will tell you when something is good, ready, or finished. There will always be things to change. You can always make the lemonade sweeter and less hydrating, or less sweet and more hydrating. It's up to you to determine if the improvement is worth the cost and when to stop adding paint to a masterpiece. And this is why it's so important to develop your taste by reading genre classics, genre bestsellers, and books on craft. The three-legged stool is so important. Which leads us to the next beware, which is to beware of your pride. Some authors blindly listen to everything their editors tell them, while other authors proudly ignore most editorial criticism. And when these authors do seek editorial feedback, they look for flattering, sycophantic editors to affirm them in their writing. But pride, as we all know, is the path to destruction. And while blindly listening to editors leads to forgetful mediocrity, pride leads to embarrassment. And I can't tell you how many authors I know who are desperately buying back every used copy of their first book that they can find in an attempt to hide their shameful freshman effort. They published it, pridefully thinking it was a masterpiece, only to later realize that it was an embarrassing mess. And if this happened to you, feel free to share your story in the comments. We can all laugh and cry with you together, because it's very, very common. And the frequency of these stories is actually what helped inspire the 9th commandment of book marketing, which is, "Thou shalt not publish thine first book first." As a new author, you have about the same objectivity about your book that a brand new mother has about her newborn. It takes time and experience to get perspective, to see your first book as it really is, and to tell if your book is ready to share with the world. My episode about not publishing your first book first came out back in 2021, if you can believe it. And since then, I have yet to meet anyone who followed that commandment and regretted it. I've met authors who regretted publishing their first book, and I've met authors who didn't regret publishing their first book, but I've never met anyone who regretted waiting. It's really worth it. Not a single person has regretted it. Now, maybe that person is right now in the comments telling their story, but I doubt it, because you learn so much writing the second book that once you've written your second book and you go back and read your first book, you can see so many ways to make it better. And you only get one chance to be a debut novelist. And if your debut novel is a polished masterpiece, the rest of your career gets easier. More people win the lottery every year than writers write a debut book that becomes a New York Times bestseller. Sure, it happens, but so does winning the lottery. It doesn't mean that buying a lottery ticket is a sound investment. Also, a lot of those best-selling first books are actually fourth or fifth books, and the author was wise enough to get good by practicing in private. But pride and ignorance are not your only internal challenges. You must also beware of your fear. Writing is scary, and sometimes we hide behind editorial feedback out of fear. Readers are drawn to authors who have a clear voice and who write with courage. Courageous authors thrive, while cowards languish in obscurity. In short, fear is bad for book sales, and you can get addicted to feedback, particularly if most of that feedback is positive. And before you know it, you're endlessly revising based on every suggestion, and this leads to over-edited writing, and you've lost your distinctive voice. Now, most authors don't use the word fear. They use fancy author synonyms for fear, words like writer's block and perfectionism. But remember the lemonade. There's no such thing as a perfect lemonade recipe. Every masterpiece on Amazon has 1-star reviews. You can't edit your way away from criticism. So what should you do if you're afraid? Well, one tip is to follow the first commandment of book marketing, which is to love thy reader as much as you love thine book. The more you love your reader, the less fear you will have. And it's said that perfect love casts out all fear. Now, I don't know if it's possible to love your reader perfectly, but I do know that as we love better, we feel less fear. But that's not the only solution. The other solution is simply courage, which is the fancy word for doing it while scared. Your feelings of fear don't have to be your boss. Courage is putting your work out there despite the fact that you're terrified. When I interviewed Jerry Jenkins about this, he talked about how once edits become changes rather than improvements, he knows the book is ready to publish. And he's written over 200 books and sold over 70 million copies, which at $15 a copy is over $1 billion of books. So courageous authors write and publish faster. And if you want to be successful, conquering your fear may be the next step. If you want more help finding your courage, I have an entire episode just about this one topic, which we'll link to in the blog version of this episode. Remember, when it comes to editing, your name is on the cover. You always have the final say about what goes in your book. And this is true even if you're traditionally published. You're an adult. This is a free country. No one can make you write anything you don't want to write. No one can make you do anything that you don't want to do. Your voice gives you power. Now use your freedom to write something amazing. And if you want help, do check out my AI editors. As I record this, I have one called Not a Developmental Editor, which I've talked about. It's designed to give you big picture developmental feedback, and it works for both fiction and nonfiction. And then I have another tool called the Structure Analyzer. This one's tuned specifically to give you feedback on the structure of your novel. I also have a tool called Not a Copy Editor, which I talked about. It gives you more specific feedback on your writing. And then finally, I have a tool called Not a Literary Agent, which can give you feedback on your writing, but also feedback on your career and other business and legal related topics. I have more tools in the works, but these are the ones that are ready to go right now. And if you want to get that immediate feedback to your writing, I recommend that you check them out at patrontoolbox.com. I should point out these tools are not intended to replace getting a human editor. And they're not intended to replace following the advice that I outlined in this episode. They're just tools to help you. You still need to read books on craft. You still need to read the bestsellers in your genre. You still need to read the classics. You can also consider reading a book by our featured patron, Joy Cleveland, who's the author of Lucy in Bloom. Lucy in Bloom is content in her routine, but when a charming new pastor, Nathan Voss, arrives with his infectious warmth and sparkle, Lucy is forced to question everything she thought she knew about love and safety. With humor, heart, and a touch of divine intervention, this contemporary Christian romance unfolds with the transformative power of love and faith, urging readers to believe in the beauty of new beginnings. Joy Cleveland, thank you so much for being a patron of the Novel Marketing Podcast. Thank you for your support that keeps this podcast on the air. I hope you're enjoying the Patron Toolbox tools. And if you would like to become a patron and get access to the Patron Toolbox tools, you can do that at novelmarketing.com/patron, or just go to patrontoolbox.com. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com, and you can find the blog version of this episode along with links to everything we talked about at authormedia.com/473. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.